At a trial in Rome in 66 BC, the great orator Cicero took to his feet in defence of a man called Cluentius. Among other charges, he was accused of poisoning his stepfather, Oppianicus, several years earlier. But this wasn't the first time he'd been accused of the crime, and Cicero describes to the court how his client's been the victim of a witch hunt, led by his own mother Sassia. In the course of this long, convoluted tale, we find some remarkable evidence, exposing a disturbing trinity of confession that existed in the ancient world, a triad of slaves, torture, and truth. In both Greece and Rome, there was a particular connection between torture and slaves, because the victims of torture were almost exclusively slaves. This perhaps shouldn't surprise us, as the whole institution of slavery was based on and maintained by violence. Furthermore, torture has often been reserved for what we might call the other, the least powerful members of society, thus making slaves the ideal candidates. But what does surprise is this. There was a belief, going back to Aristotle, that slaves would only confess the truth if it had been extracted by force. Many students, including myself when I first came to study the classical civilizations, have been puzzled and taken aback by this idea. Surely, under duress, slaves would be just as likely to say whatever their torturers wanted them to say. But the ancients, including Aristotle, were as well aware of this as anyone. Variations on arguments concerning slave testimony can be seen early on in the Greek rhetorical tradition. In the 4th century BC, the orator Demosthenes once claimed that evidence produced under torture was the only reliable means of producing truth, for it had never been disproved, while another orator, Antiphon, put forward the obvious counter-argument. Slaves will change their testimony, he said, to save themselves. This split in opinion hadn't changed by Cicero's day. In fact, if we return to the trial of Cluentius and follow the story through to the end, we'll see that Cicero argues both for the use and the potential abuse of confessions gained under torture, and he does so in the course of a single oration. If we believe Cicero, then Sassia, the defendant's mother, was a cruel and vindictive woman. Oppianicus had been her third husband, and soon after his death, she set in motion the plot to implicate her son in his murder. Her ploy involved extracting the evidence she wanted from 3 domestic slaves. 2 of them, Strato and Ascula, belonged to Sassia herself. The third, a slave called Nicostratus, had belonged to her deceased husband. She wanted them to confess knowledge of a plot to kill Oppianicus, and she wanted them to say that Cluentius had instigated it. But before being allowed to give evidence, the slaves had to be tortured, because as we've seen, it was believed that only then they could tell the truth. Cicero claims that in the first place, tortures of every kind were vehemently applied in the inquiry. The slaves said nothing, and the inquiry was adjourned. Some time later, the inquiry was held all over again. This time, every form of exquisite torture was employed. There was no end to Sassia's cruelty. Cicero tells us, and I quote, "The witnesses had been summoned, turned away, could scarcely bear to watch. The cruel and barbarous woman began to storm around, furious that her plans weren't proceeding as she'd hoped. When the torturer and even the implements of torture were exhausted, and she still didn't want to bring an end to the process, one of the witnesses said he was convinced that the purpose of the inquiry was not to find the truth, but to compel the slaves to confess to something that was untrue. The other witnesses to the inquiry agreed, and the case was dropped, for now." Cicero is wanting to smear Sassia's character here, as much as he can to help his client. He was also intending to shock his audience, both the members of the jury and the large crowd of passers-by who typically gathered to listen. For trials in Cicero's day took place in the heart of Rome's busy forum. Walking around the remains today, I often find myself imagining the buzz that must have accompanied the trial, perhaps the gasps of horror, as Cicero described what this monstrous woman had done. But despite all that, at no point does he question her basic right to inflict torture in this way. In fact, it was well within the rights of slave owners to torture their slaves to gain confessions. This right had its roots in the belief that slaves were things, a form of property. And there is ample evidence for us to work out the kind of torments that were applied to Sassia's slaves. Cicero doesn't tell us much about that, except that the tortures were exquisite, and that Sassia had employed someone to inflict them. But a well-known inscription from the colony of
Sample complete. Ready to continue?